Welcome, history lovers, to History Lab Studio. I'm Tamsin Peach from Impact Studios at UTS, and I'm here to introduce a very special new season of History Lab Studio. It's called Field Notes, and Michelle Arrow is here with me to tell you all about it. Michelle is a historian at Macquarie University and president of the Australian Historical Association. So, Michelle, what should listeners expect from Field Notes?
They should expect great variety in terms of the kinds of material they listen to. They will hear historians from different career stages and different institutions talking about the kind of passions that drive their work, the resources and archives that they use to make their histories, and the kinds of conversations that historians have all the time about method, about the communities that they work with in their history. So it's a really eclectic, but I hope really engaging series.
And how did the AHA come to want to launch it?
The AHA was really interested in thinking about positive advocacy for history. So not just kind of stepping in when an archive is under threat or a historical resource is challenged, but to actually put the voices of historians out into ordinary public debate and kind of allow them to talk about why their work is important and how it's made. Because I think that's one of the most important things, is for people to understand, in a world where history is everywhere, that historians make history, they make new knowledge, and hearing these conversations enables you to understand how that process happens.
And what I loved about listening to some of them is, well, they're themed to start with, aren't they? They take different sort of strands of history. There's one's environmental history.
That's right. So we've got environmental history, feminist history, Chinese Australian history, military history. So it's a very diverse range of subjects that our historians are going to talk about through this series.
And you get a sense of how the history writing in those different subfields has changed over time. So the questions that people were asking in the 1980s different to the ones being asked in the 90s, 2000s, 2020. And it's like history is very embedded in the times that produce it.
Yes. And it's kind of that dialogue, I think, is also really, really important. Like the first episode of the series about decolonisation histories is kind of thinking about the ways that field has developed and emerged over conversations between historians and their archives and each other over a really 30, 40-year period. To kind of create this ever-evolving field. So I think one of the key messages of the series is really that history is not static. History is shaped by the times in which it's made, and it's shaped by the kinds of people who write it and make it, because they ask and bring different questions to the work that they do.
Thanks so much, Michelle. And now for episode 1.
What does it mean to decolonise history? On the streets, it might involve toppling statues. But what does it mean for studying the past? If historians are going to reckon with the harms and legacies of colonialism through decolonisation, how do they practice history differently? And how does our view of Australia's history change when we think about Australia not just as a former British colony, but also as a former colonial power? Welcome to Field Notes, brought to you by the Australian Historical Association. I'm your host, Michelle Arrow. We tend to imagine history as a solo pursuit, but history is made through conversations between past and present, between historians and their archives, and in dialogue between historians. Our first episode features the historians Angela Woollacott of the Australian National University and Jon Piccini from the Australian Catholic University. Angela and Jon reflect on their personal journeys into histories of decolonisation, the scholars who shape their thinking, and the importance of examining power and privilege. And they discuss the ways that a decolonial perspective redraws Australia's national borders as the nation grapples with the legacies of its own colonial past.
I'm Jon Piccini. I'm a senior lecturer in history at Australian Catholic University in Brisbane, or Meanjin, Brisbane.
I'm Angela Woollacott. I'm Distinguished Professor Emerita in the School of History at the Australian National University, which is on the lands of the Ngunnawal people.
Yeah, so this is the interesting thing, I guess, Angela, because we've known each other for a while, and we started collaborating on this project around decolonisation. I've just found it such a fruitful sort of area just to think about, I guess. But how do you think you kind of got into this topic? How do you think you ended up doing something called the history of decolonisation?
Well, I think I've always, since I began my academic journey, I think I've always been interested in the history of imperialism and colonialism. I guess it's relevant that I am very aware of being a settler Australian, and that my settler roots go as far back as the 1840s when the first Woollacott arrived in South Australia and was involved in opening up copper mines in the mid-north. And, I think all of us who are settlers have some awareness of how far back our sense of historical legacy and responsibility goes. But actually, family history is not is not a great area of interest for me. It's really been much more an academic area of interest. And for me, it goes back, a long way, really, because my honours thesis at Adelaide University was in Pacific history. And then right after that, I had a job researching and writing a major exhibition on the history of Aboriginal land rights in South Australia. And then following that, I went and did my postgraduate work at the University of California at Santa Barbara in the 1980s. Then in the 1990s, I was teaching at a university in Ohio. And in a way, it was a wonderful time to be in the United States because it was when the new imperial history was just erupting and kind of blowing apart older notions of the historiography of the British Empire. And conferences were really exciting. There was a kind of electric atmosphere in which people who were drawn to the new imperial history had this sense of almost creating a historiographical revolution and kind of being the new guard who are trying to dislodge older metropolitan outwards views of imperial history, questioning the supposed positive legacies of empire. It was a time when at conferences I would come across scholars of South Asia, the Caribbean, Africa, Canada. I learned about subaltern studies, and it was very formative for me. It was during that period that I became self-consciously a postcolonial and feminist historian. And I think it's relevant thinking now about what decolonisation means, to think that back in the 1990s and 2000s, postcolonialism was understood as the process of struggling against colonialism. I think it's often been seen kind of in a simplified misconception of, post-colonialism happens the day the new flag is raised and the day independence is formally announced. And people who were really interested in post-colonial studies saw it as far more than that, as studying anti-colonial movements before independence, studying the struggles against neo-colonialism after independence. And I think that's relevant actually now for thinking about the term decolonisation, because sometimes in public discourse, the term decolonisation comes down to toppling statues. But I think those of us who are interested in it as an academic area, as a field, see it as much more about a process of dismantling the structures of colonialism, redressing the manifold harms and inequities and legacies of imperialism. And I'd be happy to, in a bit, talk some more about some of my earlier works in the field, but I'd love to hear your story about how you first got interested in this area too.
Similarly, I guess there was some formative experiences for me. I was, a bit of a precocious teenager and was involved in kind of protest movements around the Iraq War, I remember. And that was kind of when I first probably started reading work by people like Tariq Ali and other kind of more popular historians and political thinkers who were critical of empire and were kind of trying to place that war, the Iraq War, in the context, I guess, of earlier colonial histories. And then when I got around to studying my honours thesis at UQ and then my PhD also at UQ, I was kind of washed up. I was riding kind of a wave, I guess, of transnational studies in a way. So that was when we were really interested in the kind of linkages between disparate locations and peoples and ideas, and how these intersected and connected across the world. And I kind of approach this through the issue of 1968, really, through the protest movements of what we would call the long 60s, maybe in Australia, which, as you know, is a fairly kind of disparate term. Like, where do we start the 60s or where do we end it? Like, that's not so clear. But I guess for me, what was clear was who was involved in the 60s. And in my, formative days, this was people like me. It was young people. It was students. It was overwhelmingly kind of white settler activists who might have been super interested in like Vietnam or China or even Algeria or, Che Guevara in South America. But this was, in a way, it was a really kind of extractivist sort of politics. So they were just interested in taking that radicalism and sort of redeploying it in the West in their own ways. And partly I was critical of that to a certain degree in some of my earlier work, but I don't think properly attend to some of the issues I'm trying to attend to now in a book I've just written about Australia and decolonisation. Is I think I really kind of, I guess, what really made me kind of think about Australia's own colonialism and Australia's own role, not just as a internal colonizer of First Nations peoples, but external colonizer of the Pacific and surrounds, was really actually Stuart McIntyre, who was one of the assessors of my PhD thesis, which was all about 68 ex-68ers traveling the world and experiencing revolution and bringing those lessons home to Australia. And he was like, "Well, where's Papua New Guinea in this story?" And I was like, "Well, it's not there because it's not really important." Like, I thought that wasn't really an important story. Like, Papua New Guinea was a colony, yeah, sure, but there wasn't like a revolutionary vanguard, challenging Australian authority. There wasn't, like, if anything, the Papua New Guinea experience was a very quiet one, I thought, and it didn't really have a big impact on the metropole. But it stuck with me, I guess, kind of what Stuart said, and then I went back and I actually, as part of this other project, went back and started looking at the activist records. And it turns out Papua New Guinea was there. I just hadn't been paying attention. I hadn't been asking the right questions, I suppose. I think some of the questions that are posed by decolonisation, some of the things you mentioned earlier, Angela, like who we are and where we're positioned as scholars, but also kind of a broader understanding, I guess, of what does decolonisation mean. And it isn't always on the Vietnam or Algeria angle. It can occur in lots of different ways, and decolonisation can take lots of different forms. So I think once I got to asking those kinds of questions of the same sources, really, that I've been reading a decade ago or even earlier, like, I actually found things that I didn't think were there, but they were. So that was kind of what was really, I guess, the journey that I've been on to a certain degree.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting the ways in which transnational history in the 2010s was connected to imperial history, and there was a cross-fertilization, and some people were consciously doing both, and that was certainly the case for me. I was very interested in transnational, but in an imperial history context. And I guess another, in terms of the historiography that we've been talking about, another key field that opened up my thinking in the 1990s was the study of whiteness as a racial category, thinking about whiteness as a racial category based on power and privilege. And again, perhaps being in the United States was a good context for that, because it was very powerful in the US with the context of the South and African Americans. But scholars of the empire took it up too. So, there were books that came out about whiteness in the British Empire. And so what I did for a number of years was to think about that in relation to Australian history, and look particularly at Australian women and their identification with whiteness and appropriation of whiteness as a category of their own racial privilege and power. So some work I did on Australian women going to the imperial metropole featured the study of whiteness. And then also, I guess after that, the the connections between transnational history and imperial history were very much part of a book I did called Gender and Empire, which I was asked by the publisher to do a kind of study of the field book. So it was trying to sum up 20 years of historiography of how gender history had changed understanding of the British Empire. And it was an interesting exercise, and it was very interesting to think about Australia and other settler colonies in that very wide context and in terms of colonialism and post-colonialism. But that book is 20 years old now. Still read, actually, it surprises me. But I have a chapter in that on anti-colonial nationalism, so I was already thinking about decolonisation at that point. And then this same topic of thinking about the empire, connections between imperialism and transnational history was part of the area of work I went on to of settler colonial studies. And the main book I did after the next main project I did, a book that came out in 2016, my book called Settler Society in the Australian Colonies. And what I really tried to do there was because there was so much rich work coming out about the frontier violence and Indigenous dispossession. So I wanted to ask the question, how did settlers justify dispossession and frontier violence to themselves when they evidently knew we were increasingly finding out that settlers were well aware of frontier violence in the 19th century? So looking at the construction of a settler society between the 1820s and the 1860s on what had been the foundations of a set of convict colonies and maritime trading posts. I was really interested actually to think, how did they justify it to themselves? And in the end, my answer was that they were willing to live with the moral complexity because they just wanted the land. Their greed and desire for the land was so strong that they were willing to put up with it, which, I guess in a way is obvious, but it was it was an interesting conclusion to come to. And like you, my most recent work is looking at decolonisation transnationally and looking at how individuals and networks in Australia in the mid-20th century became leaders in the intellectual and political and social process of challenging colonialism in the 50s and 60s, which I think that study just predates your 1968 work. I think your 68 generation were perhaps the next generation from the ones that I'm looking at.
Yeah, I think there's some interesting overlaps between some of the people who you're looking at in that project, and some of them are literally the parents of some of the 68ers who are coming off later. It's the interesting thing to me, Angela, listening to this as well, is just thinking about how we're both, in a way, we started big, right? We started with the global, and decolonisation, thinking about that, has made us a bit more local in a way. The way you're talking about, your own experience, your own kind of family's experiences and understandings, and kind of, the way that transnationalism, for me, to a certain degree, was always about getting out of Australia, and saying, well, Australia is important in the 60s because it was connected to all these different places, right? Well, decolonisation makes us think a bit differently. I think it makes us situated a bit more in our locations, in Australia, in even our very local communities, right? And try to think about, well, how does the experience of colonialism here, not just in Australia, but also as Australians have practiced colonialism or been part of colonial enterprises, right? Not just in our region, but around the world. I think it's kind of an inversion in a way.
Do you want to talk about how you went from your 68 book is wonderful, by the way. I just love the interesting people you found when you did that project. But do you want to talk a bit about how you went from that to your project on the language of human rights, which is pretty much situated within Australian history?
Yeah, I mean, to a degree, yeah, it is, isn't it? I mean, I'm interested in, I guess, the 68 book kind of finished in the 70s to a certain degree, as you talked about the elasticity of this term, right? And one of the things that happens in the 70s, of course, is the rise of human rights language. And in a way, that's what happens to a lot of the energies of the 68 movement is they dissipate and go into, to a certain degree, the human rights movement. So things like support for East Timor, maybe, support for Amnesty International, these kinds of organizations, these human rights groups. So to a certain extent, that book was about kind of chasing the tail end of the 60s into human rights. But in so doing, I actually had to broaden the scope out a little bit to cover the human rights movement from the late 40s all the way through. And in that, I was really following as well the work of people like Samuel Moyn in the US, who were pioneering this new approach to what I didn't realize quite at the time, but is a type of really intellectual history. It was really intellectual history of the idea of human rights. I just thought it was cool to talk about ideas and stuff. I didn't realize at the time it was a whole school. And human rights then was a way of looking at how Australians engaged with and thought about human rights. And that did bring me towards colonialism and decolonisation to a certain degree, because as I argue in the book, human rights and decolonisation were actually really connected phenomenon, particularly in the international arena, where decolonisation was seen as sort of at least the first step really towards the achievement of human rights by a lot of actors in the global south. The decolonisation needed to be achieved in order to achieve the full human rights package promised by the post-war order. So that was kind of quite interesting to me. So that's kind of what led me then into the Human Rights Project as a way of kind of expanding on and kind of understanding, I guess, where the 68 movement ended up. But then the Decolonisation Project that I'm working on now, the third book, is in a way actually the book that I think I wanted to write as the second book, but got kind of waylaid in a way into the human rights space, which I'm not sad about. It got me my job, having a Cambridge University Press book. I'm not upset about that, but equally, I feel like I can finally, with the decolonisation book, I'm actually sort of finishing what I started with the thesis, and then I'll be happy to draw a line under it.
Well, the two are so closely connected, and they're very connected for Australian history, of course. And part of my current project is Everett's role at the UN and presiding over the passage of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but then how that was taken up by so many activists in Australia. So your segue from your human rights book to a book on decolonisation makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. And it kind of sparks for me, I guess, kind of thinking about these questions of method and what makes a decolonial approach to history different. For me, it's kind of come up for us already, at least one of them, which is this concept, I guess, of positionality, right? Like, I know that you've already kind of talked around this, Angela, but do you want to kind of talk a bit more, I guess, about this concept of positionality and how it has influenced your evolving work?
Yeah, well, as I said, I think even though I did not write about my family when I did the Settler Society book, I was very conscious that the Woollacotts arrived in the 1840s in that period. So I think that was a background influence. But I think that you're right that we should think a bit about positionality here, because it is so important. And I think as you were moving towards talking about methods and approaches in decolonisation history, I think it's a really critical field. And just thinking about that, there are a couple of points that I would make, and then I'd be glad to hear your thinking too. It seems to me that one of the key aspects of method and approach with the history of decolonisation is obviously the vital importance of listening to First Nations speakers and writers and telling their stories and the wide forms of history in which their stories are told. And just on that point, I've been really pleased to see that History Australia, the journal of our association, the AHA, has a new section called Dadiri, which means deep listening, and that they're going to feature the voices of First Nations people, and that they're going to make it a generically flexible, wide section. And I think that's a terrific initiative. I guess the other thing I would say about method and approach for decolonisation is the importance of making both the history and the evidence publicly available. And to me, a very emblematically successful project in this area has been the project run out of the University of Newcastle by Lyndall Ryan, who we so sadly lost a couple of years ago. But the Colonial Frontiers Massacres map, I think, has been hugely important for Australian history. That project that Linda was captain of, but there were a team of them putting together all of that evidence of the hundreds of massacres that occurred across Australia from the late 18th through into the 20th century. And the fact that that is now up there on the web for everybody to see where the massacres were, how they happened, the available evidence. So it's just incontrovertible proof now that frontier violence, frontier warfare happened across Australia for a very long time. So I think that's been a fantastic project for essentially it pulled the rug out from under those who wanted to say that thinking about frontier violence was, white, was black armband history. That whole history was black armband versus white blindfold view of history. I think it's just not, how can anyone maintain the black armband view when we've got that evidence available for everybody to find on the web now? Do you have thoughts about methods and approaches?
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of, riff off that. I mean, for me, I guess what I was thinking about is, I guess with transnational history, there was always an idea that what we want to do is we want to kind of capture as many kind of locations as possible, right? We want to kind of capture, well, where are these people going and how are they moving? But in the end, as I was saying earlier, it really kind of, that approach can, I think, really center, unfortunately, the most privileged peoples in this who are mobile, who are able to be mobile and travel around and whatnot, and kind of deprioritize the voices of First Nations peoples and colonized people. So for me, part of what's been really interesting about the work in the Decolonisation project has been really working with Papua New Guinean archives, working with Papua New Guinean statespeople, mostly statesmen, given gender, but statespeople as well, who've really kind of been thinking about, I guess, well, what does it mean to be an Australian colony? What are the benefits of being with Australia versus being outside of Australia? What does decolonisation mean for us? And having those people, I guess, really staging that they were in dialogue with settler Australians, with white Australians about what the future of Papua New Guinea looked like, and trying to really kind of restage those historical debates and those historical intellectual encounters is actually really fruitful for thinking not only about Papua New Guinean history, but for Australian history as well, because we've kind of forgotten these quite interesting dialogues that have taken place. And it's not just me who's done this, of course. There's some great work in a recent issue of Australian Historical Studies about the Papua New Guinea-Australian relationships, and great articles by Helen Gardner, John Ritchie, and others. And I guess in terms of thinking about how do we, I guess, the sources is important as well, because it's connected to this issue of, well, where are the sources? I was able to write this history of Australia, decolonisation, with a big part played by Papua New Guinean activists, because the Australian archives of that encounter are very well maintained. The Papua New Guinean side of that, through the fact that Papua New Guinea is a developing nation, doesn't have the same access to resources as Australia, that a lot of those records are in a quite parlous state, right? So there's still a certain amount of privilege that's involved in writing this history. But I think if we can be, consciously attempting to use this history, not just to tell the truth, which is what we're doing, but also as some sort of restitutive or reparative exercise, that's quite interesting as well. Whilst constantly and consciously, I think, trying to not center ourselves as the white settler historians, but rather to be giving voice, I guess, to these other voices. Yeah.
Do you have favorite books in the field? Do you think do you have particular historians that you think of as especially influential or key figures in this field?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we can't say much about this field without talking about, I know that you'll probably want to talk about her as well, but Tracy Bonavanoa Ma's book, Decolonisation in the Pacific from 2016, which I read while I was working on the human rights book, was really foundational for me in thinking about how do we write these kinds of histories? How do we write these kinds of decolonial histories that can connect multiple sites while not privileging any one site? I think is really quite important here, and looking really at how ideas and peoples can move across borders, and connecting these histories in ways that others had not really thought to do. So that was really amazing for me. But another book that it isn't quite the same, I guess, in a certain way, but I think it's coming from a similar direction for me. But I just love C.L.R. James's The Black Jacobins from 1938, which, is not a decolonial history book. It's not a transnational history book, but it's doing these things anyway. Because that book is fantastic in the way that it just is able to connect, is really able to connect the debates and ideas of what's going on in Haiti with what's going on in Paris as this dynamic during the Haitian Revolution. It's driving radicalization on both sides of the Atlantic, and C.L.R. James himself being Trinidadian in origin, he's really trying to use this history not only to tell the truth about the past, but also as a motive for change. He writes it in the 30s, but then it's republished in the 60s at the height of this kind of, you mentioned before, flag independence, at the height of flag independence in Africa and in the Caribbean. And he's saying, well, this isn't new. The history of decolonization, actually, if we go back to Haiti, well, this has been going on for 150 years now, and this is just the latest kind of upswing of that. And there's a great, if you can get the 60s reprint of The Black Jacobins, he's got a great preface in there where he kind of contextualizes the Black Jacobins in the context of the kind of historical decolonization era, we might say. What about you, Angela? What might you throw out there?
Well, I guess while you're on the sort of the older classics, I would just really briefly mention that I was very fascinated when I read many years ago, first of all, Frantz Fanon, like Black Skin, White Masks, and his psychoanalytic analysis of how racism works on individual subjectivity. That's one that I can't really go past. But, Albert Memmi and his study of Algeria, the colonizer and the colonized, and how colonialism degrades the colonizer morally and psychologically is a classic I like to remember as well. But I think in the Australian context and thinking about really important figures, you've already mentioned Tracy Banner-Vanuama, and right now thinking about decolonization in Australia, it's hard to go past her book as so influential. And the workshop that we co-convened a couple of years ago, it was the text that everybody kept coming back to, and it's influential, I think, for many reasons. But one is that she has this brilliant way of writing about decolonization as an oceanic movement. So you get this sense of not just crossing boundaries and borders, but the kind of oceanic flow of the ideas and the activists and the networks, which she locates particularly from the 1970s onwards, and how in the Pacific people were sharing ideas and movements and forms of protests across the boundaries of older empires, the different European empires in the Pacific. They were crossing those boundaries to connect, to promote decolonization. But the way that also affected Australia, I think, is so important for us to think, as you've already alluded to, the fact that thinking about Australian history, when it comes to decolonization, we have to think regionally. We have to think that, our continent has been surrounded by colonies of empires that one way or another the former colonized people threw off their colonial rulers in the mid and late 20th century. And that has had an impact on Australian history. The fact of those decolonizing movements, the ideas, the movement of individuals, it's been profound in ways that I think we are still exploring. And of course, as part of the shared work that we're doing with the book that's coming out of the workshop is exploring just how those dynamics and that flow, that movement, those currents of ideas of decolonization worked. I guess in terms of, while we're on sort of key figures in recent decades, I just have to mention Henry Reynolds, because how can we talk about decolonisation in Australia and not mention Henry Reynolds and his work for decades, insisting that we look on the other side of the frontier warfare, and see the other side of the frontier, and just making Australia confront the fact that there was warfare across the whole continent, and that we need to see the resistance fighters and the fact of the warfare. Um, and the fact I think it's significant for us too, because his latest book, Looking from the North, ends with a chapter called Decolonisation, where he's talking very seriously about how he sees this history as linked to the process of decolonising Australia. And it's a fascinating chapter. One part of it that I was really struck by was how he brings it up to the present moment. He talks, of course, about native title and the achievement of land rights and the importance of the 1990s decisions. But he brings it up right to the present when he talks about the homelands movements and how he sees a key part of decolonisation in Australia right now is the way that communities and peoples are reclaiming traditional homelands, that there is this movement to go back to country and to claim country. That where some connections had been lost, reclaiming those connections and reestablishing a presence, I think, is a really important part of it.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, just thinking about that in terms of, the homelands, I was struck. I read the book as well. It's fantastic. I'm really struck by that. The homelands and, it's kind of ideas of the unfinished nature of decolonisation, right? Obviously, we're mostly interested in the historic period of decolonisation, right? But then that process is still unfolding. Even in our own region, of course, think about East Timor, which only becomes independent in 1999. And even then, Australian neo-colonialism, we might say, is continuing in a lot of these areas. Bougainville, Papua New Guinea, is still on the cusp of independence, it seems, these countries that Australia has had such massive involvement in, Fiji as well, where Australia capital kind of continues to be the dominant power here in Australia, despite our insistent fears on China coming to take our Monroe Doctrine away from us. We've still got this massive influence all over the Pacific. And just, to tie that into a book, Daniel Immerwahr's book, How to Hide an Empire, which is about the United States, is a really wonderful kind of tool for thinking through these issues you're raising as well about, and he has the concept of the logo map, really. We've got this idea of the of Australia as a landmass, right? We see Australia as a nation for a continent in that famous phrase. But, if we view Australia and her territories and over time, that's a much different map. You've got to take in Papua New Guinea. You've got to take in Fiji, which was part of original Commonwealth discussions, or New Zealand, which still has a kind of side entrance into Australia if we can agree one day. This is we can't see art history as being defined by the logo map because it's going to weaken our own understanding of our past, but also means I think that we can helpfully we can think, well, we don't have any responsibility beyond our borders, right? The Australian body politic could think, well, we don't have any responsibilities beyond our borders. But if we are to move away from that logo map understanding and think about, well, what are the responsibilities we might have in the region as well as in the internal colony, I think that will be a good step if we can reimagine that world of Australia's bigger picture. That'll be really helpful for us going forward.
And I think you're really right to talk about the financial and capital dimensions to all this. And mining, of course, we have to think about Australian mining interests in New Guinea and elsewhere. But Fiji is so interesting, as you were saying, because, of course, Australia was never a formal ruler in Fiji, and yet we've had so much influence there and so much interest there. And not least, of course, the Colonial Sugar Refining Company and the Australians who ran sugar plantations and that huge business which did so much to control colonial Fiji. And one, to just briefly bring it a little back to my own work, I did a biography of Don Dunstan, who was such an important anti-colonial reformer in Australia in the 1950s to the 1970s. But I know from having studied his childhood that it was his childhood in Fiji that made him such an advocate for anti-racism, for getting rid of discrimination, for insisting on Aboriginal land rights. It was his childhood of growing up in a colonial sugar refining company town, and the racism that he saw around him, and the racism that he just became viscerally opposed to. So that's that kind of influence and then movement of somebody from Fiji to Australia who then made important differences here and was involved in the ending of the White Australia platform of the Labor Party, is yet another instance of the kind of decolonisation that we've been thinking about.
I mean, I'm happy with it. Like, I mean, that's such a great point to end on, Andrew. I think that the personal nature of decolonisation to a certain degree.
Could I just mention, I don't know if we're out of time totally, but the one thing that I had been needing to mention and haven't is thinking of examples of wonderful historical books in decolonisation. I just really wanted to mention a book that won the Prime Minister's Prize in 2022, and that was Shannon Palmer's book called Unmaking Angus Downs. And it's just a fantastic book, Unmaking Angus Downs, Myth and History on a Central Australian Pastoral Station. It's a brilliant book. I know that Shannon did an enormous amount of research. You know, she learned language, she spent a great deal of time on country, but it's a fascinating story of Anangu people's long and ongoing connection to a particular area of land in the southwest of the Northern Territory, how that connection was challenged by when colonisation took the land from the First Nations people, and how they then accommodated themselves to the pastoral station by working on it, continuing to live on it, but then how they gradually and creatively took it back as their own country. So they lost it through colonisation, they regained it through careful, creative, persistent decolonisation. It's such an important story for Australia, I think, as an example of how a community of people can achieve decolonisation in such a profound way. So I just had to throw that one in.
Yeah, I mean, another book that I would throw into the mix would be Jessica Owen's recently completed thesis and a book coming out shortly called Contaminated Country, I believe, which is an excellent title. And it's really about the uranium mining industry in Australia, really, and how it's related not just to, obviously the crimes that industry has committed against First Nations peoples, and also through the nuclear tests, of course, but has this fantastic way of really connecting it, I think, to the broader story of nuclear non-proliferation, trying to get nuclear testing banned in the Pacific. Activists who are going to Britain to challenge Aboriginal First Nations activists who are going to Britain to challenge, the people who are doing these tests, to seek compensation, to seek recognition. I think that's a really great book, and I think it's only just coming out now, and it's something that people should read, I think.
Thanks to Angela and Jon for joining us today. If you'd like to read more of their work, Jon's new book, Empire's End, The Remaking of Australia, will be released next year, and Angela's chapter in the new Cambridge History of Britain will be out soon. You can find links to these and more information about the histories mentioned in this episode in the show notes. Stay tuned for our next episode on feminist histories. Field Notes is brought to you by the Australian Historical Association. You can learn more about us by visiting our website, theaha.org.au. History Lab is an Impact Studios podcast made on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Field Notes was recorded and edited by Lachlan Accord.